We are back. I'm Tommy Ashley. That's Jason Staples. We're sponsored by Johnny T-Shirt and JohnnyT-Shirt.com. One in the same, one on East Franklin Street, one online. Either way, you get what you need at Johnny T-Shirt. Defensive backs, linebackers, edge rushers, and now defensive tackles. Jason, we sort of talked last week when we were talking about edge. It's basically a completely new room with a couple of players that the edges had more experience returning that were Carolina players. This year, not so much with Leroy Jackson and Peter Pazanski.
You can't even do it.
I know. So YouTube video, Leroy Jenkins. Jason made me watch it. Anyway, if
So
you're
he
watching
said
the
Leroy
show,
Jackson, and I immediately launched into in our off-air preparation. I immediately launched into Leroy Jackson.
so
And he didn't get it. So now Tommy's been inducted. He can't even say the name straight
I
face
know,
now.
and now and we are recording this. This isn't even live, but I'm gonna leave it on here because y'all got to see the. Sometimes you got to see how the sausage is made at Inside Carolina, and we have fun with it. And there's no off season, but at some point you gotta have fun with it. We're gonna have fun with this defensive tackles. I'm gonna let you talk about the two returners. When I say returners, I mean guys that were in a Carolina uniform last year. I've got a couple pictures I'll throw up here. Pazanski.
Well, that's
Leroy Jackson.
Jackson.
See what we're doing here, folks. I have already off the rails. Anyway, I might have to edit that part out. Let's get Leroy Jackson and Peter Pazanski. Jason, just sort of what did you see from them in their very, very limited opportunities? I mean, this year in practice, obviously no numbers. It's really tough to tell the big fellas when you've got no numbers. But anything you can shed light on them before we roll into our lists and our superlatives.
There really isn't a whole lot because the most we've really seen from them was in the practice like a pro evaluations. And to be honest, there were a good portion of our time there was spent trying to figure out, okay, is that Jackson or is that Mims? Okay, that's Mims. Okay. So much of it has gone into that because of the lack of numbers. Which I think is by design by the current head coach and staff. That's their way of having fun with the rest of us. So well played, guys. Well played. I'm sure you enjoy that. But there's not a whole lot to really evaluate. I mean, I've got some of the film that I can go back and look at, but even that, we've got film from a little bit further away, and it's harder to assess on some of those things than what we would be able to normally get out of that context. The thing that I can say is that both guys are, they've got good size. They're both 295 plus, I would say at this point. I mean, that's an old picture there of Jackson, but they're 295 plus. They both are a little bit on the shorter side. 6'2" 6'1". So, they're not as long as what you'd normally want for more of a three technique or a rush defensive tackle, as it were. Both more nose tackle types. But Belichick has always been able to get the most out of those kinds of guys in the past. And both of those guys have flashed pretty good quickness in the limited time that we've seen them. So, I don't think either guy is really ready for prime time this year. I think both guys are really kind of a year away from being sort of the grown men that you want on the interior to compete at this level with consistency. But who knows? I mean, a really good offseason of conditioning can go a long way at that age. And, depending on how guys develop, we'll see. And, they're thin on the inside. So one of those guys might step forward and do it. Your guess is as good as mine, to be honest, on which one of them it might be. I think both of them have shown flashes, but neither is really there yet. And, that's kind of where we are with them.
Absolutely. So knowing that, knowing what Carolina lost in the portal, and one thing we don't do is we don't talk about who's not here. You worry about who you got, not who you missed or who left. But North Carolina added three defensive tackles in the portal. C.J. Mims earlier, down Terry Robinson. excuse me, and Isaiah Johnson from Arizona. And so let's get into it, Jason. And we're talking about the defensive tackles in case you missed the lead in our comedy special there. By the way, we were discussing greatest comedy movies, if anybody was interested. But anyway,
Hey, and I just got to say, I got to tattle on you a little bit, Tommy. Tommy, you're kind of a hater when it comes to this stuff. So
I missed the reference last week. If you're a loyal follower, I missed the Tommy Boy reference last week.
The man has never seen it.
I've never seen it. Let's get into it. Let's talk about something I have seen, and that's the alpha. The alpha of the room. Defensive tackles, Jason. It's thin, like we talked about, and it's new for the most part, but the alpha's here. Who's your pick?
It's got to be C.J. Mims to me. He's the only guy of these three that was on campus in the spring. I think here's a crazy number. Total tackles for loss at the college level from the defensive tackle room. All the personnel combined.
Less than that?
Less than that. He's holding up one hand. Fewer than the 5 fingers on your hand. 3 tackles for loss career.
Wow.
For every defensive tackle in the room combined. How many of them do you think Mims has?
2 of them.
3.
He has all 3. So one man, your alpha, C.J. Mims, has all the career tackles for losses of anybody in the defensive tackle room for North Carolina.
According to the numbers that I pulled from the record books, that is accurate. So
is this a default alpha?
Yeah, to some degree. When you're choosing an alpha of the room, and you got 2 guys who've not even played really a college snap in a game, you've got 2 guys who've played under 180 snaps a piece with no tackles for loss between them and no real major production from either one. And that's it. Now, this is not counting sacks as tackles for loss. So the way that these numbers work out, that this is tackles for loss, not sacks. Now, sacks, on the other hand, you do have 4 sacks in this room that are not Mims's sacks, but Mims has 3 career sacks. Johnson has 2, and DeAndre Robinson has 2 as well. So there are a few sacks represented, but in terms of tackles for loss, Mims is the only one who has one of those. So to me, you combine that with the fact that he's the one guy who's got 3 seasons of college under his belt. Robinson is 1 season. Isaiah Johnson is 2 seasons and really only 1 playing. He had 11 snaps in his first year as a redshirt. So you're looking at a guy, he's the oldest of the 3. He's the one with the most experience, the one who's been most consistent in terms of what he's put on tape, and he's the one that's produced some tackles for loss. That's your alpha, and he's the only guy of the 3 that was on campus during the spring to learn the defense and really get completely up to speed. He's the guy that I think, especially early in the year, you're depending on him setting the temperature for the room and helping those other guys get up to speed. That's your alpha.
Let me ask a question. We're talking with Jason Staples here, and the guy we were referencing with the numbers and the hand signals, a beast. So no disrespect to the beast there. But let me ask you, what is your ideal role for a defensive tackle? I feel like people sort of misunderstand, and I understand there's different spots, but what does C.J. Mims need to do for this defense this year under Bill Belichick, you believe, to be successful? I don't think it's all about the numbers for defensive tackles. They help, but.
Yeah, and this is where, there are different jobs depending on what the call is up front that a defensive tackle has. So, on the one hand, if you're a defensive tackle in a call where you're being asked to two gap. So you have two gap. The way that this works is most defensive fronts, the way that this works, and every defensive front in modern football, it's basically the front deals with each gap, each potential gap in the running game. There's someone that's responsible for that gap. In a sort of typical front, most teams play one gap defense, where you have one player and his job is to take one gap. He maintains his leverage in that gap. He tries to control that gap, and by controlling each gap with one player apiece, you ultimately shut down the run. Two gapping is where you have a player that is responsible for two gaps. So that player is generally going to have to play more head up on the offensive lineman. And the way that it works is that he's going to control his primary gap with his own body. And then he's going to try to compress and control the lineman to such a degree that he's actually controlling his secondary gap with sort of the lineman's body and then kind of half of himself as well. So you might get, and most often you're going to get a nose tackle who might be in a zero technique directly head up over the center, and then he's responsible for each A gap. So he's got the A gap to the left of the center and the A gap to the right of the center, and whichever one the back goes in, he's responsible for that. And ultimately, there are different ways of doing this technique wise, but you're trying to control that with both of those at the same time. Now, if you're playing one gap football, normally that allows the defensive line to be more aggressive into that gap, because you're just controlling one gap. And if you get upfield in that gap, as long as you don't run around somebody and you're going through your gap properly, that penetration, that disruption that you're causing through that gap actually really causes problems for offenses. If you're a two gap player and you get too far into one gap, though, all of a sudden you've opened up a big gap on the other side. So depending on what you're being asked to do, if you're a three technique, so you're playing in between the guard and the center, between the guard and the tackle. If you're a three technique and you're playing between the guard and the tackle, and you're in a one gap defense, and you're responsible for that B gap, you're hitting that B gap and you're getting upfield and you're trying to get penetration. You don't want to get trapped. You don't want to get too far upfield, but you're trying to get in the backfield and you're going hard. If you're a zero technique and you do the same thing, you've just opened up a big gap. Your job is to occupy that player, to compress that, to tighten up those two gaps and make it difficult for the center to open anything up while also protecting the guys behind you. Normally, two gap defenses depend on linebackers and secondary players to be the guys that clean up the tackles. They actually make most of the tackles. They clean things up while the defensive lineman is actually just protecting the backers essentially by two gapping. The thing that makes this more complicated is that one of the things that Belichick sort of hung his hat on at the NFL level is, in terms of fronts, is they ran a ton of hybrid fronts with the Patriots, where instead of being an even team where they'd play 4 down or an odd team where they'd play 3 or 5 down all the time, they were a hybrid team. 1 down, they'd have 4 down. 1 down, they'd have 3 down. Another, they'd have 5 down. Sometimes they'd go into bear and have 6 down. And then 1 down, they'd have 2 guys 2 gapping on this side of the line of scrimmage, and this side of the line of scrimmage is 1 gapping. And the next down, everybody's 1 gapping. And then the next down, you've got the zero technique is 2 gapping in the center, and everybody else is 1 gapping, except for 1 backer or something. So this is something that it just depends on what your assignment is. And they're going to have to scheme around their personnel, this first year especially, to ask those guys to do what they're best at. Because you've got some guys that are better at 2 gapping. Vince Wilfork, for example, who was a Patriot for a long time, one of the best 2 gapping defensive tackles in NFL history. That you just couldn't move him. good luck. But you don't ask that guy to go and be a 3 technique and get up the field that much. Then you've got a Richard Simmons, I think is no, not that's the Kiss guy. A Richard.
No, that's Gene Simmons.
That's
is
Gene
Kiss
Simmons.
guy.
Jeez.
Richard Simmons is the exercise.
Is
guy.
the exercise
Rest in
guy, which I
peace.
should know because he graduated from Florida State. Richard Seymour. Richard Seymour, the 6'4.5", 305, 310 pound defensive tackle that they drafted out of Georgia. He was a 3 technique up the field type, primarily 1 gap defensive lineman, but they played him at end, they played him inside, they put him at 1 technique. Sometimes they would ask him to 2 gap, but mostly he was a 1 technique or a 1 gap type player. You're asking those guys to do different things. And so this is what we're going to see this year is they're going to try to assess, okay, what can we ask this guy to do that can help us, and how does that mix with what we've got behind him? So a guy like Mims is interesting because he's a guy that can kind of do both. He's not big enough to be a full-time 2-gapper, but he does show enough sand, as it were, to be able to hold his water against an offensive lineman at times. And again, you see that picture. He looks the part, but he's about 295 pounds. You'd like him, if he's going to 2-gap more, to be more like 310 at his size. But I think he's going to be a guy that primarily is going to be a 1-gap guy, but will also at times be able to slide in and do some 2-gapping. And they'll jump in and out of stuff just to cause problems for offensive lines. So if you're a 1-gap guy, you're expected to put up more numbers. If you're a 2-gap guy, you're just not going to put up the kind of numbers that a 1-gap guy would, but you might actually be doing your job more than the guy that's putting up those numbers.
There it is. You know what we need? We need to develop a way that you can draw on a chalkboard and people can see it on the screen. We got to figure that out this year. That would be pretty epic for that discussion right there. But I hope that helped folks understand what defensive tackles are supposed to do and what they're not supposed to do, because I see a lot of people not really understanding the numbers. And this person doesn't have X amount of sacks. They must not be any good. Well, yeah, listen to Jason discuss it. We're talking with Staples here on the defensive tackle room. One of my favorite things is when we get together, we say, we're going to do this in 20 minutes. And then I ask one question. And I missed Buck Sanders' hourglass. One question. Let's go on. Let's move down. We're going to breakout. We're going to a breakout player on this group. You got Mims as your alpha. You still got Robinson. You still got Isaiah Johnson out there.
That's a hard one because it really could be either Johnson or Robinson. Both guys are in position to break out. Between the two of them, I'm going to go with Johnson as the breakout guy because of a couple reasons. One is he's the build to be the 0 technique, 2-gapping type guy. The fire hydrant type. He's 6'1", 311, might be a little bigger than his listed weight, and he is a load. He's hard to move, and he's one of those guys that I think with what Belichick is going to want to do this year in terms of defense, it's going to be so critical that they're able to stop the run on those early downs, and they're going to need defensive tackles who are able to hold up at the point of attack. And of the 3 guys on this roster, the guy who's probably most equipped in terms of just strength and raw power to do that, it's Johnson. And he also happens to be following along outside linebackers coach Ty Nichols, who's the new outside linebackers coach for Carolina, was at Arizona with Isaiah Johnson, and was working with Johnson as a defensive line GA at Arizona. So if nothing else, there might be just a little bit more familiarity there that might help a little bit, even though it's not the same position group and all of that. He was also, again, he was a guy that was specifically identified by a coach who had previously worked with him. And, the way that this is going to work is Nichols is going to get to Chapel Hill and be like, there's one guy that we could really use back there. That's the way that this works. And if I was going to guess, I'm going to go with him. He also, it's interesting, you don't really see the impressiveness in terms of the pass rush pop, but then you look up and he's got a 10.2 pressure rate on his pass rush snaps. So, which is really good from the interior. So, I think there's enough potential there to think that he might be the breakout guy.
That is Isaiah Johnson from Arizona. A lot of commingling here with Carolina and Arizona lately on the basketball side, on the football side, on the baseball side. It is weird how it works. We are talking with Jason Staples. Don't even talk about it. You see the ball back there? That should be an Omaha baseball. I should be in Omaha right now doing this show. I digress. Talking with Jason Staples, sponsored by Johnny T-Shirt and JohnnyT-Shirt.com. One thing they can do is they can get you all the swag you need. If you're an inside Carolina person, go to JohnnyT-Shirt.com. If you can't get to them on East Franklin Street, tell them IC sent you. Get 10% off your order if you're a premium subscriber. Jason, moving right along. I kind of want to do Young Buck to watch, but I'm not sure we have a bunch of Young Bucks to watch.
I'm going to go with the entree on that, though.
Okay, well, hit it.
I mean, this is his second year in college. He's the youngest guy of the 3 transfers. You got a fourth year in Mims, a third year in Johnson, and a second year in Robinson. And Robinson, man, does he look the part. He's one of those first guy off the bus types. You watch him on the field against Florida, and you go, oh, man, that looks like a Florida State, Alabama, SEC, Miami of Florida type defensive tackle. He looks like one of those guys. And he was. He was at Florida, right? He was a blue chip guy that Florida brought in, and he showed some indications, some flashes in that first year, but just never really took the leap as a freshman. But he's got some really nice physical tools. He's the longest of the 3, 6'3". I think his wingspan is probably 6'6" or 6'7". He's got very obviously long arms. And he's just one of those guys. You watch the movement skills, some of that, and you go, man, he could be really good. But he's just not, he didn't really show it beyond some flashes in year one there. He's got, like I said, some fluidity to him, some movement skills, but then you watch him and he's the last hat off the ball too often, right? You watch him and he just doesn't really explode in the ways that you kind of want him to, you expect him to. But then you watch him take off and chase, and you go, okay, in terms of pursuit, if he actually turns on the speed, he's got a little bit more to give there. And if he can learn to play with urgency and they can put him in the right spots, I think he's the guy to watch. And he's also a guy that I think you can play at the 5 technique sometimes. That's outside gap of the offensive tackle. He can play the 3 technique, and he could even slide all the way inside. So he's a really versatile piece, which is what Belichick really likes to have. And of these 3, he's the most like a Richard Seymour type from what they've got. He's not that level, but he's got some potential, and he's a guy I'm really interested to see grow. And I mean, I want to see how quickly these guys get developed, because you've got no time like the present. They're going to have to actually develop and show that they can develop these guys in year one. It's going to be a good litmus test for, how much of a difference that kind of coaching can make in a year one.
Let me ask you an obvious question. How many defensive tackles do you need on a team? I mean, 3 is not enough. You need 6, I would think.
Minimum of 6, yeah.
So we've discussed 5. Where's the 6th one?
Well, this is tricky because you have a couple other guys that are, I think, going to be playing inside at times. So
that's another picture of Leroy Jackson, by the way.
Yeah, number one of the things that they did when they went out and they got edge transfers is they got several edge transfers who can slide inside and play defensive tackle at times. So I would not be surprised to see Smith Vilbert, who we talked about in the edge group, play essentially defensive tackle half the year. He's a guy that, you get him to 290 pounds, which he could very easily carry, and all of a sudden you got a 3 technique. And a 3 technique with more twitch than most 3 techniques have. Even though he's probably below average twitch for a power end, you put him in the 3 technique and he's probably above average there for that. So he's a guy you can move inside and do some things with. You can have him in a 4-eye or a 5 technique at times, and I think you're going to see that. Melkart is another guy who you go back and you watch the Delaware tape, and they did slide him in at times. Sometimes he's at the 3 technique or the 4-eye. So all of a sudden, he's essentially playing a defensive tackle role on some snaps. And at 265, 270, he can probably hold up and handle that at least some of the time. Even Yates, who's more of your rush end in this defense, he's 265. He slid inside at times. He actually played at defensive tackle in certain packages for UConn. He played out wide as a wide rusher at times, and then at times he lined up in like an inside linebacker spot where he was mugging the A-gap and doing different things. So he was very versatile. You're going to get that from him. And then Joseph Mopoi, who we've not talked about yet because he has no real snaps to speak of. He's an edge guy. I've listed him with the edge guys, but he actually got moved to defensive tackle by Penn State last year during the season, or maybe even in camp last year. So he's another guy that probably you have to put at least halfway with your defensive tackle room. So now you've got 3 guys that you brought in as transfers. You've got the couple holdovers that you have from the Mac Brown tenure. And then you've got really 4 edges who at different times can slide in and take some of those snaps and some of those roles. And you have a defensive coach and coaching staff that is very well known for moving personnel around and putting 3 defensive ends on the field and on one snap, 4 on another, and having them slot in different spots just to cause offensive lines problems and identify the mismatch. Like, oh, well, we're going to put Melkart over this offensive guard this game because we think he's going to beat him like a drum with his quickness. Maybe. So I think that's what they're going to have to do. How much they can scheme around not having the true definite, like, that's a defensive tackle bodies remains to be seen. But I think you're going to see Vilbert lining up at the 3 technique and at the 4-eye. You're going to see Melkart sliding in at times. You're going to see a lot of different mix and match personnel combinations. And if you're doing that, then all of a sudden you really need a minimum of 2 quality nose tackles. You'd like to have 3. And then 1 or 2 sort of 3 technique types. Because at that point, if you're playing a lot of odd type stuff, now your other defensive end, your big end, is essentially another defensive tackle. And now all of a sudden your personnel looks a little different. So how many you need, it can change. If you put truth serum into this staff, I guarantee you they'd say they'd love to have 6 first-rate, 5 stars at defensive tackle. But they don't. And so if you ask, what do you really need? They'd say, well, we need to have the versatility and the big bodies that we can move around to cause mismatches. And that's what they're going to do.
It is a puzzle to be put together because, like you said, the pieces aren't all there. So you still got to make them fit, especially on the defensive line. They've talked about building from the inside out since day one. This is where the rubber meets the road, right here in this position. Jason, we've got a couple other things we haven't talked about. Time to prove it or Mr. Consistency. Which one do you want to take last? And then I'm going to ask you where the room ranks.
I don't really know that we have a time to prove it guy. None of these guys is late in their career. I mean, maybe Mims is time to prove it. I mean, he's in his 4th year. The other guys are all like first and second. Isaiah Johnson's a 3rd-year guy. When a 3rd-year guy is the oldest guy in the room, the second oldest guy in the room, you're young at that position. And that's usually not a good thing when you're, having your defensive tackles against grown men on the offensive side of the ball, on the line of scrimmage. Age matters in there. So it's going to be interesting to see how much that impacts things. But I don't think they have a time to prove it guy in this group. And then in terms of Mr. Consistency, none of them have actually played the most snaps any of them have played in one season is Mims at 339 last year. He was a halftime in the rotation backup at ECU. And that's the most snaps that anybody in this room has played. I guess he's Mr. Consistency as well as your alpha because he's played the most snaps and, held up pretty well. Looked good in those snaps. But he hasn't played anywhere close to kind of what you're going to expect out of him this year. And you just don't know how these guys are going to handle the increased snap load. The biggest concern that I have for this group is injury. If you lose one of these three transfers to injury, you go from thin to really thin. And then that can, depending on when that would happen, if it happened, then you're talking about, having to really scheme around something that other guys' snap counts start to really climb, and it impacts you as you get later into the season, even against teams that otherwise you might beat like a drum. Suddenly you've got a weakness there that's a real problem in the second half of games and things like that. So they need to stay healthy there for sure. They've got some guys I think that they can work with and they can work around. And like I said, they brought in so much versatility with the guys that are, that came in kind of technically as edges, especially the two Penn State transfers. And Melkart to some degree, that they're going to be able to mix and match. But like I said, it's thin, it's young. This is the place where both the floor and the ceiling of the Carolina defense in 2025 is really going to get determined. If they're good on the interior, there's going to be a really good defense. If they get banged up or have some real weakness there, it's hard to be really good on defense when teams can just run it up the gut on you. So, but if there's one defensive coach in the history of the game that you can count on, that you would say, okay, I'm going to bet my house on that guy being able to scheme around some weaknesses on the interior to prevent teams from being able to run on him. Is there anybody else that you'd bet on over Belichick?
Nope.
So that's really what you're hanging your hat on coming into 2025. And to me, that's going to be really interesting because, the old saying is that the NFL is a coach's league because the NFL, the gaps between talent in the NFL are much smaller. It's sort of like the every year you get these arguments, or every couple of years you get these arguments of like, could the number one team in college that's dominating everybody, could they beat the worst team in the NFL? And it's, you hear people say like they've got 50 guys on their team that are going to play in the NFL. And my response to that is always like, yeah, that 1-15 Atlanta Falcons team, you know how many guys on that team play in the NFL?
Actually play in the NFL?
All of them. They've got practice squad guys that are in the NFL. And the gap, all of those guys in the NFL are NFL players. So there's a smaller gap between those guys. The guys that are elite in the NFL, those guys are so ridiculous because the margins are so small in the NFL that to be that much better than your peers, you really are a freak. You're a freak of nature to be that. But it's a coach's league because you can, when the other margins are so small, coaches can make a bigger difference. In college, the old rule of thumb is it's a players' league. It's a players' game because the difference between the players that Georgia or Alabama has and North Carolina has and Toledo has are pretty significantly different. If you take Kirby Smart and you have him coach Toledo and you have Toledo's coach, whose name is escaping me at the moment, I've been on the golf course with him before, but you take Toledo's coach and you put him out there on Georgia's side, you know who I'm betting on?
Georgia.
Candle. That's his name, Candle. I'm betting Coach Candle and those Georgia Bulldogs to beat Kirby Smart because college is a player's game. Well, we're going to find out exactly how far those margins go to some degree with this Carolina team, at least on the interior, and I'm really interested to see it.
That is a perfect way to wrap this one up. I know we usually where the room ranks and all that, but that's it. I'm not going any further. We're done. That's a great ending. If folks are watching this and want where the room ranks, ask in the chat. Ask on the message boards.
Ask.
Jason.
Don't
Jason will be on there to come defend his rankings and discuss it. It's always a fun place to go. Tar Pit Premium Message Boards. It gets you 10% off Johnny T-shirt. It gets you Jason's scouting reports. Those things are as in depth as it gets. You've got Robinson, you've got Johnson, you've got Mims. They're all available right now on the Tar Pit Premium Message Boards if you hadn't checked them out. These podcasts are great. The stuff that you need to see is on the Tar Pit Premium Message Board. Jason, it's always a pleasure.
It's always fun, Tommy.